Jane grew up in a small town where dreams were a luxury and survival was the only goal. Her family lived in a rundown wooden house at the edge of the village, but they carried hope like treasure. Her parents believed that one day, Jane would lift them out of poverty, not through education or luck, but through marriage. That dream took the shape of Obinna, the only son of a wealthy businessman. He was tall, well-dressed, and known for his sharp tongue and arrogance. To Jane's parents, he was a blessing. To Jane, he was a curse she had to smile through. At first, Obinna pretended to care. He bought her gifts, promised her security, and convinced her parents that he was the best thing that could happen to their daughter. But once he had her, his mask slipped. He shouted at her, insulted her family, and hit her whenever she dared to speak back. Jane cried silently most nights. Her mother told her to endure. Marriage is never easy, she said. Rich men have tempers. Her father stayed quiet, ashamed but helpless. Jane's world was small, her dreams fading with every bruise. But one rainy afternoon, fate intervened. As she hurried home from the market, her plastic bag tore, scattering fruits and vegetables into the mud. Before she could bend down, a hand reached out to help her. It was Dave, a tall, dark-skinned man with gentle eyes and a quiet strength. He had just moved to the city for work. When their eyes met, Jane felt something she hadn't felt in years: safety. Dave smiled as he helped her pick up the food. "You should be more careful," he said softly. That night, Jane couldn't sleep. For the first time, she wondered if love could exist outside pain. She didn't know it yet, but that brief meeting would change everything, and lead her down a path of love, sacrifice, and betrayal. From that rainy afternoon, Dave became a small light in Jane's dark world. He started showing up at the market every week, pretending to need the same vegetables or asking about directions he already knew. He didn't flirt or push, he simply talked. And Jane, who had spent years walking on eggshells around Obinna, found comfort in those conversations. Dave was new in town, working as an engineer at a construction firm. He had no family there, no reputation to protect, only his honesty and quiet charm. He treated everyone with kindness, especially Jane. When she laughed, he listened like it was music. When she spoke, he looked at her like her words mattered. At first, Jane tried to resist. She told herself it was wrong, that she belonged to Obinna, that her parents needed her to keep the peace. But every time Obinna raised his voice or threw a cruel insult, her thoughts drifted to Dave's gentle smile. Their meetings became more frequent, sometimes at the market, sometimes by the riverbank where she fetched water. Dave brought her small gifts, a book, a scarf, a rose he picked himself. Jane began to dream again, something she thought she had forgotten how to do. But secrets never stay buried for long. One evening, as Jane returned home later than usual, Obinna was waiting by the door. His eyes were dark, and his voice low. "Where were you?" he asked. Jane's heart pounded. "At the market," she whispered. He stepped closer, his breath heavy with anger. "You're lying." Before she could explain, his hand struck her cheek. She fell to the floor, her tears mixing with blood. "Don't ever think you can fool me," he spat before storming out. That night, Jane lay awake, her face swollen, her heart shattered. But beneath the pain was a spark, a realization that she couldn't keep living like this. The next morning, she made a decision. She would see Dave again. Not to escape her misery, but to remember what love was supposed to feel like. And that decision would change both their lives forever. After that night, something in Jane broke. But in that brokenness, she found courage. She started meeting Dave again, only this time, she no longer hid her heart behind fear. She wanted to feel alive, even if it meant risking everything. They met in quiet places, under the old mango tree behind the market, by the riverbank where the sunset painted the water gold. Dave would listen as Jane told him stories about her past, about the pain she hid behind her smile. He never judged her, never pitied her. He just held her hands and promised, "You'll never cry like that again, not with me." For the first time, Jane believed those words. Dave treated her like something fragile and precious, the complete opposite of Obinna's cruelty. He would brush the hair from her face, bring her fruits from the city, and tell her how beautiful she looked when she laughed. But while love blossomed in secret, danger lingered in the shadows. Obinna grew suspicious. He noticed Jane's newfound glow, how she hummed while cooking, how she no longer trembled when he entered the room. His pride couldn't stand it. One afternoon, his friend mentioned seeing Jane near the river with some dark tall stranger. Obinna's blood boiled. "She dares," he muttered. His ego was wounded, and when pride meets anger, destruction follows. Meanwhile, Jane's world had become brighter. She dreamed of running away with Dave, far from the gossip, the bruises, the fear. Dave wanted it too, but he was patient. "When the time is right," he said. "We'll start a new life. You and me." Jane smiled and rested her head on his shoulder, whispering, "You're my peace, Dave." But peace never lasts long in a world built on secrets. That night, as Jane sneaked back home, she didn't notice the figure watching her from across the street, eyes filled with rage, fists clenched in silence. Obinna had seen everything. From that night onward, Obinna changed. He spoke less, but his silence was heavy, the kind that made Jane's heart tremble. He watched her closely, his eyes sharp and cold. Every time she left the house, he asked where she was going, when she'd return, and who she'd meet. Jane sensed that he knew. But fear kept her quiet. She avoided Dave for a few days, hoping things would calm down. Yet, her heart ached every moment they were apart. Dave noticed her absence too. He sent word through a friend, asking if she was safe. When Jane finally met him again, she broke down. "He suspects," she whispered, tears spilling freely. "I can't keep hiding, Dave. I'm scared of what he might do." Dave took her hands gently. "Then leave with me," he said firmly. "We'll go far away from here. I'll protect you and our child." Jane looked up, startled. "Our child," she echoed, almost forgetting the new life growing inside her. She had just discovered she was pregnant, and though fear clouded her mind, love filled her heart. Dave smiled, resting a hand on her stomach. "This is our beginning," he whispered. But fate was listening, and fate is rarely kind. The next day, Obinna followed Jane secretly. He saw her meet Dave behind the church, saw how they held hands and how Dave kissed her forehead with tenderness. Something inside him snapped. His pride couldn't bear the humiliation. That night, Obinna drank himself into a storm of fury. "She made a fool of me," he muttered over and over. When Jane returned home, the lights were off. She called his name, no answer. Then, out of the dark, came the sound of shattered glass and a voice twisted with rage. "You think I don't know?" he shouted, stepping closer. His eyes burned with madness. Jane's breath caught in her throat. The storm had arrived. And by the next dawn, someone would not live to see another day. The night was heavy with thunder and rain when Obinna's fury finally exploded. Jane stood in the corner of the room, trembling as he smashed a bottle against the wall. His eyes were wild, filled with drunken rage and humiliation. "You've shamed me, Jane," he roared, stepping closer. "You think I don't see how you sneak around with that man?" Jane backed away, her hands trembling. "Obinna, please," she whispered. "He's just a friend." "You're mistaken." Her voice only fueled his anger. He grabbed her arm, yanking her so hard she cried out in pain. "Liar," he shouted, slapping her across the face. "I'll teach you what happens to women who betray me." Outside, lightning flashed. Inside, the storm tore through their home. At that moment, Dave arrived. He had come to surprise Jane, to bring her food and a letter he'd written for her and the baby. But when he reached the door, he heard her scream. Without thinking, he kicked the door open. "Let her go!" Dave shouted, charging at Obinna. Obinna turned, furious and drunk. "So it's you?" he spat. "You think you can steal what's mine?" He swung his fist, hitting Dave across the jaw. The two men fought violently, punches, shouts, the sound of breaking furniture echoing through the small house. Jane screamed for them to stop, but neither man could hear her through the chaos. Then, in a blur of panic, Jane saw Obinna grab a heavy wooden stick. He raised it to strike Dave. Acting on pure instinct, Jane snatched a metal rod from the floor and swung it with all her strength. The sound that followed was deafening. Obinna froze, eyes wide, then collapsed. The stick slipped from his hand. He didn't move again. Jane dropped the rod, her whole body shaking. "Obinna," she whispered. Dave knelt beside him, pressing his fingers to Obinna's neck. Silence. No pulse. Just the rain outside and Jane's broken sobs filling the room. She fell to her knees, crying uncontrollably. "What have I done?" Dave looked at her, his face pale. He took her hand gently and said in a trembling voice. "You didn't do this, Jane." "I did." And with those words, the man who loved her most sealed his own fate. The house was silent except for the rain tapping against the roof. Jane sat on the floor beside Obinna's lifeless body, her hands trembling, her dress stained with blood. Her mind couldn't comprehend what had just happened. Dave held her tightly, trying to steady her breathing. "Jane, listen to me," he said softly, his voice shaking but firm. "You have to stay calm. You didn't mean for this to happen." Jane could barely speak. "He's dead, Dave. I killed him. What will I do? They'll take me away. My parents." Dave stopped her with a look that broke her heart. "No," he whispered. "You won't go anywhere. I'll handle this." Before she could argue, sirens echoed in the distance. Someone had called the police, maybe a neighbor who heard the fight. Panic filled the air. Dave stood, took one last look at Jane, and wiped the tears from her cheeks. "Promise me you'll take care of yourself," he said. "Promise me you'll protect our baby." Jane's eyes widened. "Dave, no." But he was already stepping toward the door as the flashing red lights approached. When the officers burst in, guns raised, Dave lifted his hands slowly. "I did it," he said. "I killed him." Jane screamed, trying to run to him, but one of the officers held her back. "No. It was me." "He's lying," she cried. But no one listened. Dave didn't even look back. He only said quietly, "It's okay, Jane. Let me do this for you." The next few hours blurred together. The police took pictures, bagged evidence, and carried Obinna's body away under a white sheet. Dave was handcuffed and led out into the storm. Jane collapsed to the floor, sobbing his name over and over. Later that night, she was questioned but released. Dave had confessed to everything. He never changed his story. Weeks later, his trial was swift. With no lawyer, no witnesses, and no defense, he was sentenced to 20 years in prison for manslaughter. When the judge asked if he had anything to say, Dave simply replied, "Sometimes love means losing everything, even your freedom." Jane wept in the back of the courtroom. And as they led him away, she realized that the man who saved her had also destroyed himself for her. After Dave's sentencing, Jane's world crumbled. The house that once echoed with laughter and love now felt like a tomb. Everywhere she looked, she saw ghosts, Obinna's shadow in the doorway, Dave's smile in the fading light. People in the neighborhood whispered. Some called her cursed, others pitied her. Her parents, once proud, could barely look her in the eye. The scandal had stripped them of their reputation. And Jane, carrying Dave's child, found herself completely alone. Months passed, and the whispers turned to silence. Jane gave birth to a baby boy, a child with Dave's dark skin and warm eyes. She named him Daniel, after Dave's late father, hoping that somehow the name would keep a piece of Dave alive. Raising Daniel wasn't easy. Money was scarce, and Jane took whatever work she could find, washing clothes, cleaning houses, selling vegetables at the market. Every night, she'd sit by the window, whispering to the stars, "He did this for us." She wrote letters to Dave, dozens of them, but none were sent. What could she say that would make his suffering any lighter? Sometimes she'd imagine him reading her words, smiling faintly, telling her it was all worth it. Years passed, and Daniel grew. He had his father's gentle heart and curious spirit. Every time he laughed, Jane saw hope. She told him his father was a hero, that he worked far away and would come home one day. But hope is a fragile thing. It fades slowly, like the color of an old photograph. One afternoon, after more than a decade of waiting, Jane received a letter from the prison. Her hands shook as she opened it. Inside was a short note, written in Dave's handwriting. "Don't wait for me. Live, Jane. Be happy, even if it's not with me." She cried for hours. That night, for the first time, she stopped writing letters. She stopped waiting at the window. She decided to survive, not for herself, but for Daniel. Years would turn into decades. And by the time 20 years passed, the world had changed, and so had Jane. But destiny was patient. Because one day, the man she once loved would return. And nothing could prepare her for what he'd find. The gates of the prison creaked open with a metallic groan, and a tired man stepped into the sunlight for the first time in 20 years. His hair had turned gray at the temples, his skin was rough, and his eyes carried the weight of time. But behind that weariness was still Dave, the same man who once loved a girl named Jane enough to give her his freedom. He stood still for a long moment, breathing the air of the outside world. The city had changed, new roads, taller buildings, unfamiliar faces. Everything had moved on, except him. He had no family left, no home to return to. All he had was a memory, Jane's tear-streaked face the night he was taken away, and the promise he had made to protect her. Dave spent his first few weeks doing odd jobs, saving every penny, asking quietly about her. Some people remembered the scandal. Most had forgotten. But one old neighbor finally told him, "Jane left the old house years ago. She's in the city now. Married again, I heard." The words hit him like a blow, though he had always known it was possible. Still, a part of him refused to believe it. He had survived 20 years behind bars because of one image, the thought of holding her again, seeing her smile. That dream had kept him alive. He found her address after days of searching. His hands trembled as he stood before the gate of a neat little house. Laughter drifted out, the sound of a child playing, a woman's soft voice calling from inside. Jane stepped out moments later, holding a basket of laundry. She was older now, lines on her face, gray strands in her hair, but still beautiful in a quiet, graceful way. Dave froze. The world seemed to stop. She didn't notice him at first, too busy with her chores. But when she finally looked up, their eyes met. For a moment, neither of them moved. The years fell away, and they were young again, standing in the rain, holding each other's hands. Then reality returned. Behind her, a man's voice called out from inside the house. "Jane! Who's at the door?" She turned, startled. And Dave, quietly lowered his head. He understood everything in that one moment. Jane's heart froze the instant she saw him. Time seemed to bend, 20 years vanished, and the man standing at her gate wasn't an old stranger, but the young, strong Dave who once promised her forever. "Dave," she whispered, almost afraid to believe her eyes. He smiled faintly, the kind of smile that carried a lifetime of pain. "Hello, Jane." For a moment, neither spoke. The air between them felt heavy, full of words that couldn't be said. Behind her, the voice of her husband echoed again, calling her name. She turned quickly, her hands trembling. "It's no one," she said softly, her voice breaking. She stepped outside and closed the gate behind her. The years had changed them both, but the memory of love still lingered, fragile, buried beneath the scars. "I didn't think you'd ever want to see me again," she whispered. Dave looked down at his calloused hands. "For 20 years, Jane, you were the only thing that kept me alive." Her eyes welled with tears. "I tried to write to you," she said. "I wanted to visit, but—" "I know," he interrupted gently. "You had to live. I told you not to wait." Silence stretched between them. She studied his face, the wrinkles, the tired eyes, the quiet strength that hadn't faded. "You took the blame for me," she said, her voice trembling. "You lost everything." He shook his head. "I didn't lose everything. You're here, alive. That's enough." A tear rolled down her cheek. "I'm married now, Dave," she said quietly, as if confessing a sin. "My son, he doesn't know anything. He thinks his father died before he was born." Dave smiled faintly, though his heart cracked with every word. "That's good," he said. "He should remember his father as someone who loved him, not someone who lived behind bars." Jane sobbed softly. "I'm sorry," she whispered. He reached out and brushed away her tears, his touch trembling. "Don't be. We did what we had to do." For a long time, they stood in silence, the past hanging between them like smoke. When Dave finally turned to leave, Jane called out softly, "Will I ever see you again?" He paused, then smiled sadly over his shoulder. "You already have, Jane. That's enough for me." Dave walked slowly down the quiet street, the sound of his footsteps fading into the evening wind. The sky was painted gold and crimson, the kind of sunset that once made Jane smile. He didn't look back, he couldn't. Some goodbyes had to be silent. Behind the gate, Jane stood frozen, tears falling freely. She watched the man who once gave her everything, his love, his youth, his freedom, disappear into the distance. Her heart ached in a way words couldn't describe. She wanted to run after him, to hold him one last time, to say thank you for the life she was still living. But she couldn't. She had a husband now, a home, and a son who believed his father was a hero. And maybe, in some twisted way, that wasn't a lie. That night, Jane sat on her porch long after the stars had come out. The world was quiet except for the sound of crickets and her thoughts. She closed her eyes and remembered the young man who once made her feel safe, the way he laughed, the way he said her name, the night he promised, "I'll protect you." And he had. Even when it cost him everything. Far across town, Dave sat on a park bench, watching the same stars. He thought about what could have been, the house they dreamed of, the child he never got to raise, the life that slipped through his fingers. Yet, somewhere deep inside, he felt peace. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a faded photo, a picture of Jane from years ago, smiling at the riverbank. He looked at it one last time and whispered, "You were worth it." Then he folded the photo carefully, placed it under the bench, and walked away, disappearing into the night like a shadow that no longer belonged to the world. The next morning, Jane found the photo there, carried by the wind to her doorstep. She pressed it to her chest, tears soaking the edges. Some love stories don't end with forever, they end with sacrifice. And for Jane and Dave, that sacrifice was the price of love.